So here's my watercolor setup. For these techniques, you will need some watercolor paper. I've separated mine into 9 different shapes because we'll be going over 9 different watercolor techniques. Take a look at your paper and see if you have 9 separated shapes. I've also taped the border of my paper. This is going to prevent my paper from warping as we add water to the paper. Sometimes it changes shape. I have 2 cups of water. I like to keep one clean and one for dirty water. I keep my paint palette closest to my dominant hand since I'm right-handed. That's on the right-hand side of my setup. I have 2 different brushes. You can use any types of watercolor brushes that you have. I also keep a paper towel handy, not just for drying off my brushes, but we'll use this in some of our techniques. I have some table salt that I'm going to use for a technique, and I also have some rubbing alcohol as well. Last but not least, I'm going to need a pencil for some things in this technique video. So you can go ahead and take the eraser off of your pencil. We are going to use this for the sgraffito technique. All right. The first technique we're going to go over is called flat wash. We are going to use our paint palette where the different colors are. It's called your paint set. And then the lid that we opened up is your paint palette. We're going to drop some water on there from our clean water, clear water, and we are going to use that water to activate the paint and mix it together on our palette. Mixing your paint on your palette is helpful because it prevents you from mixing your colors, so your blue will always stay blue. And it also helps you decide what type of opacity do you want. Do you want some paint that is opaque, paint that you wouldn't be able to see through? Do you want some paint that's translucent, that you can see through it a little bit? Or do you want some paint that's transparent, that you can see all the way through it? So mixing your color on your palette helps you decide this. For your flat wash, we want it to be in the middle, kind of opaque, translucent. You want to be able to see that color. We're going to apply the color across your paper, and you want your flat wash to be one flat color. We don't want to have some areas light, some areas dark. We want to have the entire shape be the same color. And this is harder than it sounds because as the water moves around, it's going to make some areas more opaque, some areas more translucent. So what you want to do is make sure you have an even coat of that color all the way across your paper. So this technique is called graded wash. For this one, we are going to start with our brush fully loaded with paint, and then we are going to slowly add water onto our brush as we go across the shape. You could also do graded wash with a color. Instead of dipping it into water, you would dip it into a different color slowly until you have created a fade to the next color. So I'm starting out with very, very opaque. Can't see through this color at all. And then I'm going to transition, add a little more water, and my color is going to become more translucent. As I move across the shape, I'm going to keep adding water until one side of my shape is opaque, the other side of my shape is transparent, and it's a translucent fade in the middle. As I'm creating my fade for the graded wash, I realize it's very, very dark in one corner and then super light on the other side. What I'm looking for is a smooth transition from one color to the next, so I'm going to rework my layers a little bit. I'm going to get some clean water on my brush to try and pick up some of the paint off of one end. I can dry my brush off so I soak the paint off the paper. And I can go back to my darker color and add some more darker paint close to that edge so it fades out more gradually. When I'm done with my graded wash, it's going to look like a transition from one color to the next. So this technique is called wet and wet. It's because it starts by putting water actually on your paper before you start painting. So go ahead and get some clear water. This is why it's good to have 2 water cups with one clear, one dirty. So you want to take some clear water, fill up the whole shape that you're going to be using for this technique. And once the paint is going to hit the water, we really won't have full control of what happens to the paint. So this is a good exercise in letting go and watching the paint do its thing, being free. We're gonna get some paint on our paintbrush and start out by just lightly touching the layer of water with your paintbrush. And you'll see the paint absolutely spread out and travel across the watery surface that you have laid down on your paper. You can choose whatever colors you want, and you can just kind of play around and let the paint do its thing, switch some colors, practice your color blending, see which colors would look nice together or which colors might turn into a different color when mixed together. All right, so I'm speeding it up for you guys a little bit here so you can see the effects of how the water actually moves. When you put it on your paper, you might not notice how the water is gradually spreading out, but when we have it on time lapse, you can see how as the water is drying, it's traveling across your paper. This is my favorite technique to use when we're doing something like a galaxy effect because of how the color just naturally blends. However, this is a risky technique because you never really know what it's going to look like when it dries. That's mostly up to how the paint reacts in the water. So try it out for yourself, use some different colors, see what type of blending happens, see what type of cool patterns that the paint creates. Sometimes it has these little branch things where it branches out. Sometimes it ends up looking more like an amoeba or something you would see under a microscope. There is many possibilities you can get with this technique. This technique is called lifting off. It starts exactly the same way we started with the flat wash, but this time, while the area we've painted is still wet, we are going to use a paper towel to lift some of that paint off. It's going to create some cloudy type shapes. So I'm kind of just dabbing my paper towel to create different little cloud shapes. That's lifting off. For this technique, we'll be using salt. When you mix your color for the original flat wash, make sure your paint has a lot of water in it. Salt is hydrophilic, meaning that it absorbs water. Salt and water are just best friends and they love being together. So after you have your flat wash down there while your paint is still wet, put your brush to the side and take a little pinch of salt, sprinkle it on top. This reaction is not immediate, it takes a little time, so we'll check in on this once it's dry. The next technique we're doing, we will need the rubbing alcohol. So we're going to begin with the flat wash just like we did when we used the salt, and we want an even coat of the same color on that area. As you're using your paintbrush to make a flat wash, think about how the rubbing alcohol we're about to put onto this paint is hydrophobic. If salt was hydrophilic and alcohol is hydrophobic, what do you think the difference is? Make sure your paintbrush is dry when you're dipping it into the alcohol. As it sets down on the water, you can see it is repelling or pushing the water away. So hydrophobic alcohol does not like the water. It is going to repel it, creating these clear shapes that you can see. This technique is called dry brush, so we will need to dry our brush off on the paper towel to get started with this technique. Then we are going to put it in some paint that doesn't have much water at all. As we put it onto the paper, you'll see that the bristles of the brush are creating texture, kind of like a grassy texture or a furry, fluffy texture. When you go back to get more paint, you'll need to dry your brush off again so you can see the texture that the bristles make. This works really well for getting some unique textures into your watercolor painting. This technique is called sgraffito. That's an Italian word that means to scratch. We're going to take our pencil with no eraser and use the edge of our pencil to scratch into the paper. You can do horizontal lines, diagonal lines, little designs, however you want to scratch into your watercolor surface. I'm going to draw a little S for Simpson's art class. Once you're happy with your design, you can go ahead and pick any color, do a flat wash over the areas you've scratched, and the paint will sink down deeper into those scratches in the paper. For this technique, we are going to be doing some splatter painting, also called the spatter technique. But first, I'm going to show you that graded wash with another color like I was talking about earlier. So instead of doing a flat wash for this one, we're going to do a graded wash. You can start with one color, and then what you're going to do is grab some of a different color and add it into only one side. Now, instead of going back for water at this point, I'm going to go back to the alternate color that I had. So I'm going to be mixing my colors together. One side's going to be more of that teal, and the other side is going to be a light green. You can use any colors that you'd like to for any of these techniques. So once my graded wash or gradiated wash is dry, then I'm going to use some black paint to do the spattering or splatter painting. With my brush, I'm just going to lightly hit the top of it. That's going to create these droplets coming off. There are different ways that you can create these splatter painting droplets. You can also use the brush to flick the bristles. It's a little bit more unpredictable, but it is really fun to see what the splatters do. Just note that your other techniques might be a little at risk for getting some of that color on top of what you've already done. So another way that you can use splattering is putting your pencil underneath your brush and lightly tapping your paintbrush onto your pencil. So try some of these different techniques and show me your splatter painting or spattering technique on your paper. Okay, let me talk to you about removing this tape. It's better if you do it carefully and slowly, and also at an angle. Notice I'm not pulling the tape straight in the same direction. I'm bending it at an angle. If I was pulling it straight, that would look like this, but I'm bending it at an angle, and that's going to keep my paper from tearing. All right, y'all, let's keep creating.